for a quick introduction, I'd like to introduce our CEO and co-founder of Entytle, Vivek Joshi. Vivek has roughly 30 years of industrial B2B sales experience with aftermarket, and he's really passionate about the opportunities that are available for OEMs to really transform their install base, and that's really what led him to start Entytle. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Vivek.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Aaron. Appreciate that introduction. Folks, welcome to today's event. Those of you who attended many of our events may notice that this is going to be slightly different. I'll have a bit of an introduction here, and then I've really got some fantastic guests that I'd like to introduce to you in about a minute or so. And this is going to be mostly a Q&A format, very little presentation, if not maybe a couple of things at best. And we're going to go ahead and kind of get the show started. So without further ado, I want to get into the early introduction material, if you may, and then kind of set up the introduction for our folks. So, about 3 weeks ago, we hosted an executive advisory board of some of our customers. We had a really interesting roundtable discussion for about 4 or 5 hours with aftermarket leaders and business leaders from industrial OEMs that we work with. And, we asked a lot of different things, but in the context of today's discussion, a big topic of discussion was, what do you guys really see in the market today? What is the economy feeling like? And what was surprising in some ways was that most people are saying the business is generally good, right? Almost everybody we talk to has record backlog right now. I mean, they're sitting on huge amounts of orders, some of it due to supply chain disruptions, admittedly, but there was some demand that came through. They've been able to exercise pricing power. We talked to one CEO who basically said, listen, I've raised prices twice this year on equipment and parts, and they've been holding so far, which surprised me again, but so be it. They were able to pass through some of the inflationary pressures on to their customers. And then because of COVID and because of some of the other things that happened, people really had started managing their OpEx quite aggressively. And there was some natural tailing off of operating expenses because of people not coming to work, people not traveling so much, and so on and so forth. And so they've been feeling pretty good. People think they're going to meet their operating plans for this year, both in the top line and even better on the bottom line, right? So they all are feeling pretty good. But what they also started saying that they were beginning to start feeling like the things are going to start slowing by the end of the year. And it's a whole host of things that made them feel that way, right? Certainly the interest rate increases as recently as last night, when the rates went up another 0.75 of a point. Inflation, they're still surging, 9.1 in June, I believe, which is a big number. And housing is cratering as we start speaking, and that's going to ripple through the economy. People are also seeing sudden demand changes, right? Things that are hot, like e-commerce in the pandemic. You guys, if you paid attention to the Department of Commerce report recently, they had this big spike upwards in 2020 to 2021. And then guess what? Is a reversion to the mean. So it's kind of going back to that growth rate. And what that means is all the overbuilding that happened, like Amazon announced, cut back in warehouses and hiring, and that kind of stuff's beginning to ripple through. A lot of European customers are seeing the effects of Ukraine. We're going to start seeing it, I think, sooner or later. And then there's this sense of over-ordering through the supply chain. I'm not going to go to that point, but people are expecting the next shoe to drop one of these days, right? So that's kind of what they were beginning to sense. And guess what? Today's GDP report that came out said, you know what? This is now the second quarter in a row that we've seen a contraction. Admittedly, it's nothing like what you saw in the Q2 of 2020 when the thing just created 35% down. It's about 1.9 last quarter, down 0.6, 1.6 and then 0.9 this as of this morning's report. I'm sure they'll revise it again. But GDP is certainly decreasing already, right? So this thing has started again, right? That we were all afraid of not being able to get going. So, in that regard, everybody starts saying, okay, well, how do I handle it? What do you do? This time is different. There's inflation. There's the slowdowns of the demand pattern. There's great retirement, great resignation, you name it. And I always say to this thing, every time people say something like this time is different, I always whisper, no, it's really not. We've seen this movie before. And, I've been thinking about this for the last couple of months because I've been hearing this a lot from our customers and prospects. So we thought at this point, it'd be great to get people who actually seen this movie before a couple of times. And so without further ado, let me use this as a way to introduce our 3 guests today. We've known these folks for, I don't know, a couple of years at least, maybe more. And I've just got to truly enjoy, A, their personalities. Each one is different and interesting. B, the depth of knowledge is amazing and experiences. And C, they're not shy about expressing the point of view. And I thought this is a good place to kind of bring people in and have them see what these three OGs, as we call them, have a chance of doing this. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Sam, Michael, and Ron. So Sam, instead of me telling the folks your story, why don't you give a 30-second intro to yourself, if you don't mind?
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's going to be fun. I was a VP of two service companies, one in the data communications area and one in the analytical instrumentation area. And then when I left the analytical instrumentation, I went into consulting, and that's what I'm doing now. We're working primarily in the area of revenue growth and some go-to-market work. And I'm having fun and would like to join in and talk with you. And the last thing is that for the last couple of years, I've been a subject matter expert on Thomas Insights, which is it's a good daily newsletter almost. As it's worth signing up.
Great, thank you so much, Sam. Mr. Giuntini. And by the way, if those sharp-eyed folks will notice that Ron is the only guy who doesn't have the Entytle logo in the back and doesn't have his name at the bottom, and he's special. That's why we kept him that way. Go ahead, Ron.
Thank you, Vivek. Hi, my name is Ron Giuntini. I've been involved in the aftermarket commercial side, B2B, for 45 years. Started off running the supply chain for a manufacturing operation that provided parts for the commercial OEM market. Then I ran aerospace business unit for 10 years and for the aftermarket. And I've been working as a consultant with both commercial and military OEMs, specifically for the aftermarket for the last 20 plus years.
Excellent. Good to have you here, Ron.
Thank you.
And without further ado, our final panelist, Michael Blumberg.
Thanks, Vivek. Thanks for inviting me today. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's watching. I'm a career consultant. I began my career actually working for my father, who started a management consulting firm focused on this industry of aftermarket service. So I feel that I have much more than 35 years of experience. I feel like it's more like 50 or 60 years having him as a mentor. We've done a lot of work helping companies manage service as a strategic profit center, to go from a cost center to a profit center. Ultimately, it's all about how we've helped our clients get and keep happy, profitable customers. I've written a lot of articles on the topic, conducted a lot of studies, spoken at a lot of industry conferences on the topic.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael. Thanks, Sam and Ron as well, for that introduction to your backgrounds. So what I'd like to do is, again, like I said, this is slightly different. I'm going to stop sharing the screen because I want to go to a bit of a Q&A session now, right? So I set this meeting up by saying life seems to be good for most companies we all deal with, yet clouds are forming on the horizon. And the big question that I have for everybody out here is like, okay, well, if these clouds are really forming, what do you think is really going to start happening and when? Again, this is not about forecasting the next GDP downturn or next whatever. It's really a question of, what should people start thinking? Remember, I said, every time people say this time is different, it's really not. So maybe with that as the framework for setting up the questions, Sam, maybe I'll ask you, if this time it's not different, what are the things that people should be thinking about in terms of what to expect, if you may, right? Given all these signals that we're seeing in the market. So maybe love to kind of understand your thoughts on that one. Then I'll obviously go to Ron and Michael to kind of pick up some of these questions there as well. Sam?
Okay, so thanks. So to me, the first thing that's going to happen is that that inside our companies, we have some people that in good times used to be called part of the sales prevention team. The finance guys and the legal guys, and the one who are focused on watching the details and the money. And when things are good like now, they kind of blend into the background. I think that they're going to come out of the woodwork again, that there's going to be increasing pressure on cutting expenses. I think there's going to be a real issue now of how good is the business doing? Because as Vivek said earlier, the companies say that sales are good, but with inflation, is it the revenue and the dollars coming in that's good, or the number of units that are sold are good? And I think that there's a lot of, no, I read something on LinkedIn today that said there are more lies created on Excel than on Word. And I think that's what's happening, that sales are increasing, but not in dollars, but not in units. And that is going to have the knock-on effect long-term for the aftermarket, short-term for installations and tech support. And I think those are the kind of things that are going to really come. And the last thing I'll say is there's going to be pressure to cut people. And you've worked hard to build up a workforce, and you've worked hard to keep them. And you know that if you lose them, they're never going to come back, and the replacement is not going to be very good, and will need a ton of training, which you won't have time to give. So be prepared and start digging in now about the headcount.
So lots of knock-on effects, right? So one thing maybe, I know, Ron, you're very attuned in my mind to a lot of the financial aspects that Sam talked to. What do you think, again, this is again trying to say, okay, these are the movies I've seen before, right? In your experience, do you see a lot of this where people are quote unquote making hay while the sun shines? Like today, just maximize operating margin, maximize what you can take out in terms of balance sheet benefits and so on and so forth? Or is it, let's start stowing stuff away for a rainy day, including making investments that help us come out of this downturn better and faster? What's your take on things as you observe these companies?
It's very rare that leadership actually plans to punch through a recession by investing in their infrastructure. I mean, it doesn't happen. Usually for most OEM, which is a sad story, when production tanks as regards to CapEx reductions in recession, again, look at a recession, you're talking about 1.6%, 0.9%, right? That's peanuts in the big picture. But it stops the acquisition of new CapEx, but the aftermarket actually increases, okay? My experience has been actually running an entire division aftermarket in an OEM is the first thing they do is cut across the board. It's just, I don't care if your business is growing 30%, all right? I'm cutting everyone, because if I have one business unit suffering, I'm gonna make everyone suffer. So when you cut back the very nature, remember during a recession, most aftermarket businesses generate somewhere between 60 and 110% of the profits of an OEM. And it's massive, all right? So you're cutting the very part of your business, which is keeping you afloat, all right? I've seen this story time and time again. It's going to happen now, all right? And the aftermarket will suffer, leadership will suffer. That's what's going to happen.
Sorry, I was muted, Ron. I think this is the kind of what you were talking about, this kind of story, right? So we actually found some research, as you can see, this is from a JP Morgan report from a couple of years ago. And they had done some interesting tracking of information or performance, if you may, of equipment growth, aftermarket growth, and overall organic growth. And to the point both Sam and you made, it is all about the fact that the aftermarket winds up being an interesting buffer for a lot of these guys. And unfortunately, Ron, like you said, sometimes the whole peanut butter approach of cutting costs, no matter what it is, everybody gets the same treatment is unfortunately true. The other part that happens out here, which I think is the second chart I wanted to just share with you guys in this context, is the organic growth rates are better overall with people with a better performance in the aftermarket and the stronger focus in the aftermarket. So you also have that outperformance as well. And these were, again, this is the same JP Morgan Cazenove report that I mentioned earlier as well. Michael, if you think about this performance picture here, what both Sam and Ron talked about, what is your perspective? What are you seeing about the focus on aftermarket and install base? You clearly talk to tons of people in the manufacturing world. You're consulting with people. What are you seeing in here? Is it consistent with what Ron and Sam said, or is it slightly different?
It's consistent. So a knee-jerk reaction of many companies will be to cut costs, eliminate things they think are unnecessary, maybe even lay off people. That's short-sighted. I think the companies that will be successful, at least what I've seen in the past, and I think would happen in the future are the ones that are going to be able to be as relevant as they possibly can to their customers and to their employees. Look, your employees are going to be worried that if recession is coming, inflation, if my job's safe, maybe I got to leave this company and find a job elsewhere. If the writing on the wall looks pretty bad. So we got to be relevant to both. Aftermarket picks up, revenues pick up because customers are holding onto their equipment longer and need to maintain it. So there's more of a demand for those services. And unfortunately, some customers, we'll scratch that, some companies think since we're cutting costs across the board. Therefore, aftermarket service is going to be another place they're going to cut costs. So we have to brace ourselves. And what happens is people start training and expecting customers are going to say no to their offers and negotiate downward, and they get themselves into a downward spiral. So we've got to learn to stop that. So I guess the short answer is I see the same things, but we need to really think about investing our time, money, and efforts in building up that aftermarket service business and making it relevant as possible to customers.
But I'm going to make one statement. I'm going to ask you guys, and maybe I'll start with Ron this time, a slightly more provocative question, which is, the phrase that comes to mind is, aftermarket sometimes is the Rodney Dangerfield, right? Some of us know who Rodney Dangerfield was, and it's all about no respect. And Ron, I think you've used those words in different ways to describe some of the behavior that we see in some of these manufacturing companies. In your experience, what does an aftermarket leader, because I look at this participant list today, there's a ton of people who have aftermarket responsibilities or service responsibilities or post-sales responsibilities. What do you tell them in terms of how they should position themselves, position the work, and really kind of make this not a Rodney Dangerfield moment for them, but really come to the forefront of the business thinking? What's your advice to them?
It's really one way to do it. When you see things going south in regards to the overall economy, things will be cut. You have to be able to go to the CFO, put together pro forma income statements and balance sheets to tell them preemptively that don't touch me, all right? Because this is what's going to keep you guys going, all right? And I've done that successfully and unsuccessfully, depending on the individuals. But you have to talk peer to peer with the CFO. If you go into a CFO and you don't have the ability to employ the terms that they're familiar with, besides, well, my customers are going to get hurt, and no one loves me if you don't provide us with the funding we need to make our customers successful. You're going to get thrown out. I mean, I'm not being cynical. I'm just saying you have to talk their terms. So you have to educate yourself. You have to be proactive and aggressive in doing that, or you're marginalized almost instantaneously in most companies.
That's a very important point. And I think some of this stuff is kind of being a little bit more assertive about the value of the business, demonstrate the value in terms of the performance and how that works, and kind of making sure the ROI or the business case is made around that. So I think that's a very important point, Ron. Thank you for that. Michael, as you make your journey into the customers that you work with or clients that you work with, and to go back to Ron's point, right? So one is to go to the CFO with a very clear compelling business case of why this matters and why this investment matters. What have you seen in terms of people repositioning their business correctly in terms of getting this to the forefront? Have you seen some good examples that you can share with people, or what you've seen in the manufacturing world around you in that regard?
Yeah. I've seen companies expand their service portfolios and make acquisitions in this type of economic environment. And besides the pro forma, they're also educating themselves and educating the CFO with benchmarks and best practices and market sizing and forecasting data to show, look, there's a big market out here, and we've done our market research to look at what impact taking away service, reducing the service will have on customers, as well as what impact offering more services or better services in terms of the quality of the deliverable, what impact that will have. So, I've helped with companies make that transformation by expanding their portfolio. One of the companies I worked with, they decided to expand into an area called multi-vendor service. They were servicing their own equipment, and they saw that the equipment in their customers' facilities was similar there. They were competitors, and they thought, well, why don't we service that equipment too? Our customers aren't doing a good job. We have people who know how to fix it. We know where to get the parts, so we'll do that. I've seen also companies expand their parts offering by adding more value-added services around the parts, like providing a technical support center. So when someone calls for a part, they could also help them troubleshoot and see if that is actually the right part that they need, suggest and recommend additional parts they might require.
Yeah. No, that's actually interesting that we talked about multi-vendor stuff. So I'm going to pick on this topic on the multi-vendor piece. Have you seen people do that systematically in this kind of climate, or even people do that? Because interesting enough, we had a call yesterday with a prospect, and when I asked him about multi-vendor, he's like, yeah, we can barely serve our stuff. Who the heck wants to go after somebody else's install base? What's your take on it?
Okay, well, let me step back a little bit first, and that is there are companies out there that a couple of years ago realized that the growth can't keep going. That there's got to be a limit, and so they set plans in place to change their business. So if you think about GE has shut off tons of business, tons of people, but now they're in position to fight and survive through periods of inflation. I mean, I know of an interesting company that owned 6 or 7 companies that are in a similar business, but with slightly different products. And they said, the way, we've got to survive, we've got to build up a credible service organization, and we have to present a good, solid face. And so they started taking the service businesses out of the product side and made one service company to service the whole base. So I think that we're going to see more and more of that, of people making the drastic change first of really tidying up their portfolio, either by buying companies that complement what they do, changing their structure, looking around and saying, oh, this one, yeah, we sell a lot of product, no aftermarket revenue, and so we're really sensitive to what's going on. We ought to get rid of them. So yeah, I think that's going to happen. Yeah, people are talking about multi-vendor service. Absolutely, it's not trivial. There are there are some interesting competitors out there in many industries called the third-party services. So if you're in a medical business and you're selling into hospitals and selling patient monitors and that, you can't go out and service imaging systems, but you can certainly do other lab systems, and that makes sense. But in that case, you're not competing with the OEM necessarily, but the individual third-party services who are servicing a broad suite of products in the hospitals or in the manufacturing companies. So yeah. I think that when you talk about these things internally, you have to be realistic. You have to really understand who your competition is. I mean, I think one of the first lessons I learned in service that was hard for me to believe is that my competitor for service is the end user.
Yeah.
And we always discount that. Who's your competitor? Oh, okay. Well, I'm at ABB. My competitor is Siemens. No, your competitor is the repair guy on the floor. So it's more complicated than just saying we're going to bring on another product line in our world and do it. The world today is very complicated.
Great. Before I go to the next topic that I want to bring up, I see at least one question there. Aaron, you want to kind of bring that question up and maybe ask it?
Yeah. So how do you view this and last year's labor shortages across industries relative to stated prediction that some companies might proceed with layoffs? Is this a contradiction? Not sure who you want to take that one over, Vivek.
Why don't I let these guys buy some? I'll buy them some time. So what's interesting is last week ago, a couple of weeks ago, at the advisory board I referenced earlier, this topic of crew change, great resignation, retirements, whatever you want to call it, this notion of shortages that were identified were real. But what's also interesting is the layoffs that we keep talking about are not necessarily broad-based. I think there's certain functions and certain areas that are probably going to get affected more than the others. And I don't know which ones, but I do know for a fact that the places where we have the most painful shortages, which is on the factory floor, potentially the technical services, field service, and other areas, may probably be the last ones touched, because you barely can get enough people in the front door to kind of get those jobs filled, right? And so it may or may not be a contradiction, mostly because it doesn't apply on a broad-based basis. At least that's what we're hearing, but it's going to apply to certain functions. And I dare say that it's going to apply to functions that are quote unquote knowledge worker administrative versus a frontline manufacturing / service person. I'm going to stop. That is what I heard. I'll maybe Michael, I'll let you see if there's see if you want to take this on, or let's should we hand it off to either Ron or Sam? What do you
Yeah,
think?
I'll take a step at it. So I agree with what you're saying. I think we're going to see layoffs in management initially. Also, some companies have high debt ratio. So if they're not generating revenue, if they're lowering profits, then they're in for trouble and they might have to lay off people.
Sam
know,
or
he's-
Ron? Sam, I think I see your hand up there. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, so I think what everybody's saying is really right, because it is, but the solution is what Ron was saying, and I want to make it stronger. Your best friend in your company should be the CFO. You know, you should be going to lunch with that person a couple of times a month, and just getting really tight with them, so that, and telling your story in bits and pieces, so that when the time comes for the CEO to say, CFO, okay, how many people should we take out of the service? You can't. Yeah, the guy's got to be able to say from his heart and from his brain. You can't, because they're doing this and this and this and this, and that's the fortress that has to be built around the service organization. And the other part of it, though, was really is that once they start shucking off businesses, that's a whole different world.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting, Sam. And I think I'm going to, before I go to Ron, I dare say this is as a general statement, but to respond to the question, unfortunately, even in corporations, she who lobbies well and hard tends to get protected. And to some degree, Sam, what you're saying is that as aftermarket and service professionals, it's our responsibility to make sure we're quote unquote lobbying, and in a good way, right? Lobbying isn't just the bad K Street people as we talk about in the US, but it's about making sure you're always making the case as to why this business is important, why it's attractive. And so the CEO and CFO and other leaders always have that in their mind. And that's that lobbying that needs to go on. So that's a great point, Sam. Ron, anything to add to that before I move to the next topic that I want to do?
Usually during downdrafts, obviously the whole focus is on efficiency, not effectiveness within the organization. So that opens the door many times for the introduction of technology that can have a nice return on investment. Just like we saw during the pandemic, where in the past, all techs had face-to-face meetings. Now they have remote meetings, which is much more efficient, which was driven by the pandemic. Some of that will stay, some of that won't stay. But I think this will also be a trigger for some innovation, at least in the United States, for moving forward with the employment of technology to be more efficient.
You know, I'm going to use that as a way to piggyback one, to go back to the question we were asked on this technology, on the layoffs and other stuff, and whether it's a contradiction. I'd actually argue that what Ron just said at the end is what we've been, I don't say believing, but thinking about, which is fundamentally, if industrial companies and OEMs do not automate, do not digitize, they're going to be in trouble. And our friend Sam here has shared an interesting article with us recently, and we were preparing for this webinar from a management guru called Ram Sharan, who talked about the, I guess, 10 or 11 rules or 10 or 11 things to do in the kind of climate we think we're going to enter. And one of them is do not give up digitization, do not give up automation. You got to continue investing in it. But Ron, I'm going to go back and pick on you on this one, because you completely contradicted yourself from 20 minutes ago, where you said, yeah, that's all good, but these guys will never invest forward-looking technology, forward-looking things. How do you reconcile your two contradictory statements there?
Well, this is where devices or software as a service come into play, where you've moved from CapEx to OpEx so that the cost of entry is quite different than in the past. All right, so this is the exciting part about, obviously I'm a big proponent of XaaS, all right, but that enables you to embrace technology at a much lower price point than in the past. So I can see that actually accelerating during these times. So that's how you get around. You forget about CapEx. You could never employ these technologies using CapEx. You know how that goes, all right?
Yeah.
But with the different models, it's a whole different world.
You know what's interesting is what you just talked about, CapEx versus OpEx. I'm going to pivot to two different questions here in the last 10, 15 minutes we have here. We also talked, gentlemen, as we were preparing for this webinar, we also talked about the fact that all the things we talked about in terms of aftermarket and services start with the install base. And again, some of us have been around long enough to remember that famous phrase from the 1992 elections, is the economy stupid? In this case, we're going to repurpose that phrase to saying, is the install base stupid, right? Some of you remember that. Now, I'm going to go back to Sam to kick this part of the discussion off. But Sam, we talk about install base a lot, but how much do you really see people paying attention to it, right? It's one thing to say, it's another thing to do. What's your take on things? Because in our line of work, we see lots of talking versus doing about the install base.
Okay.
How's that for a setup?
That's not good. But you think about what happens when your company gets a good sale. First thing that happens is the chief sales guy goes out and rings a bell, and and physically rings a bell and sends out an announcement. We just got this order. We just landed Joe Blow for $500,000 a day. All kinds of stuff. And then when the service guy comes gets the invoice information from a field service visit, he says, how do I make a big deal out of going out for 4 hours and using some parts? So I think the adrenaline comes from the sales, the new product sales, but the revenue and the profit really does come from the aftermarket, and it's hard. I think it's almost like it's embedded in us that we get excited for these one-off giant events, and we don't have those in service very often.
I know.
And when we do, it's frequently because something went down and we did something absolutely dramatic and saved the account, but which is making some good out of a bad thing. But the aftermarket, your installed base, they are critical to the business, because not only do they buy the spare parts and the service contracts and all those good things, but they tell their friends and associates, they make the recommendations, they tell you what they want for the next generation, and they're buying. So they are the future, but the glory goes to the sales guys up front, and that's really a challenge. And so part of the service organization, every company, irrespective of size, should be that they have a visible cheerleader. In your company, you're out there, Vivek, you're on all the webinars, you're out there talking about the company and your customers and what they're doing and what you're doing. Every one of us in this business has to assume that role. That needs to be built into the job description as tribal knowledge and not written down. But being the cheerleader for the aftermarket is the job, in my mind, of the aftermarket leader.
I'm going to use that to go to Michael. Michael, recently you ran a survey and you wrote a white paper on the installed base and, A, the lack of ownership or cheerleader, like Sam just talked about, and B, just practical difficulties of doing this, right? So maybe in a couple of minutes, if you don't mind, just telling the folks on the webinar what the highlights of what you found were.
First, about the installed base data, whatever companies are doing, even if they're a leader, it's still not enough. There's so much rich market intelligence, business intelligence in that installed base. You have to just do whatever you can to extract as much and analyze as much. So what we're seeing from the survey is that most companies are not taking full advantage of the installed base data. The biggest reason why is the data is in disparate databases and systems, and they're not aligned very well. So there's a limit to what service leaders can do in terms of analyzing the opportunities and preparing for those opportunities. What companies are attempting to do is move towards the concept of installed base platform. It gives them a single solution that brings together all of this disparate data from different types of systems of record and systems of transaction into a single source of truth about what's going on. And they're being able to be what might seem like creative. One is that they can look at what's the propensity to consume, what's the propensity to buy spare parts, what's the propensity to buy maintenance contracts, and make decisions and target customers and come up with targeted sales plans and sales approaches to reach these customers, something that they wouldn't think about.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to some of the investment stuff that Ron was talking earlier as well. Somebody needs to make this investment. And, Rob and I, a couple of my colleagues on the phone today, we speak with prospects and customers all day long, and the kind of urban sprawl we see in terms of the systems and the headaches people have to go through to even just put that together is really painful. We're at about 11:41. We've got about somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes left to be respectful of everybody's time. I'm going to go to Ron, and you said something, Ron, a few minutes ago that I want to pick up on, because this also came up in our conversation with the executives a few weeks ago. Ron, you talked about as a service and the transition to as a service. What's interesting is we had at this event, we had the leading management consulting firm come in and talk to us about it. And there is a definite move to thinking more actively about this. It's clearly started at the high value stuff that certainly the four of us and some of us on the phone have seen and heard this before, which is the GE jet engine or the Rolls-Royce jet engine business, or the power turbine business with power by the hour, all the different constructs for as a service. But that the management consulting firm also found out in the survey that, to the point you made, Ron, earlier, is not everybody has the courage to kind of make those moves early, right? And so the phrase I use is a bastardization of the Hemingway phrase, right? How do people go bankrupt? Gradually, then suddenly. And I wonder if it's almost like this whole gradually but suddenly thing, Ron, in terms of movement to as a service, right? When's it going to happen? And is this recession going to be the impetus for people to go there?
Well, actually, the sector that has totally embraced as a service is robotics as a service. This is a fast growing technology-based sector. We're talking about drones, we're talking about underwater air drones, underwater drones, factory drones, a bunch of different things. About half of these products are being introduced as robots as a service, because how do you price these items when 80% of its value is IP? It's totally out of period. Manufacturing cost of goods is probably 30% of the selling price. So how do you price it? What they do is they look at the alternatives. For example, security surveillance as a service with a robot. All it does is go around, a drone goes around a warehouse where you used to have a security guard paying $15 an hour. Well, they charge $9 an hour. Oh, what a great deal. I get the same point. It may cost the robot OEM $2 an hour. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. So we're starting to see that as a major area, and they're cleaning up. And most of them are VC sponsored. A lot of them are not even PE owned at this point. They're mostly VC owned. They start off right away, nice margins. So we're starting to see that. And usually, given the history that I've been involved with products as a service since the late 70s, okay, with aircraft engines and brakes and a bunch of other stuff. Usually when there's new technology, customers are a little uncomfortable. They don't even know the technology, but they understand its outcome. So what they do, as the OEM says, don't worry, I'll take care of all the risks. I'll take care of the maintenance. I'll take care of the entire product for you, and I'm going to charge you a fixed rate per use. And that's the door that opens up for OEMs.
Yeah. I think what you said is actually interesting, is the maintenance cost is subsummation, if that's a word, of all these different costs of ownership, that to come back to that shortage of workers question and layoffs at the same time, my experience may be the wrong word, but my interpretation of what I'm seeing in the world today around us is that sooner or later, whether people like it or not, we're going to go to some form of as a service, because you know what, that's about the only way to get around this shortage of people and knowledge and talent and so on and so forth, right? The more you embody this in IP and so on and so forth, we can get there. There's a question in the chat. Sam, I see you put a hand up. I want to go to the last couple of thoughts on this topic, gentlemen, before we go to Q&A. So Sam, since you put your hand up first, you want to go ahead?
So I agree with Ron that it's going to happen, and I think that the inflation period is going to drive it, because what happens with the as a service is it's really another way of saying pay per use. You only pay when you use it, and if CapEx is really constrained by the company, and whether it's cash or whether it's debt ability, the pay per use works.
I wanted to add to that.
You're
So
100% right, Sam. Good question. Go ahead, Michael.
So two things. I think that we are seeing a slow adoption of as a service in some industries. And when I've spoken to clients, a lot of it is they're not getting their thinking around it properly. They're not coming up with the right value proposition or offering or pricing around it to make it attractive for customers. But the other thing, in contrast to that, is around the time of the early stages of the pandemic, I spoke to both clients who were service providers and their customers, and they thought to themselves, gee, I wish I had bought an as a service contract because I'm not using the factory, and I wouldn't have to be paying so much for using the equipment or for the maintenance coverage. I would just pay when it's in operation. I think we'll see more of it. And as the concept takes on in other industries and other product market segments, we're going to see our customers ask for it, maybe even beg and demand that we offer that service as a service.
Great points, gentlemen. It's let's see, it's 11:47. I see a couple of questions in the Q&A. Aaron, you want to go to them, and then after Aaron goes to these couple of questions, and we can quickly handle them. My colleague Rob, who's also on this panel right now, he's going to bring it up for a summary page. He's been capturing the summary of some of these thoughts here. So, Aaron, over to you, please.
Yeah. So, what role can marketing play to really counter a recession for industrials?
I'll take that. So it's a huge role. So you really have to stay relevant in front of your customers. There was a study that was done by Xerox many years ago and said that after 27 days, your customer forgets they've ever had an interaction with you and starts thinking about other things. So you got to stay in front of them, making sure that you're relevant, telling them how you're going to help them. Another thing that might happen during a recession where people are looking at cuts is they're going to look at their maintenance and say, we haven't had any maintenance events in the last year. We don't need to have a contract in place. Well, you've got to, as a marketer, you've got to make them understand why they need that maintenance contract, because you can't predict when it's going to fail. So you need to have that backup.
You know what's
I
interesting
interject on that.
Ron, can I say one point before I let you jump in, or you want to go ahead and jump in if you have a quick point?
I'll just a quick point is, I might be more crass, but what I've done during recessions is I doubled the commission for salespeople for aftermarket sales. That's simple. Nothing.
You know what
no
gets,
rocket scientist
how you get paid affects what you do. That's a damn good thing. There's nothing crass about it. It's just a fact of life. You know, one thing I would say to you is to what Michael is saying is I read something, and we all known this intuitively, but I saw a report. I can't remember whether it's one of the consulting firms that publishes the stuff or not, but there's almost like a direct correlation between companies who start cutting off marketing in times like this to what they don't get in terms of new lead flow, deal flow, opportunity flow 6 to 9 months to 10 months down the line, because you just choked off your growth by doing this marketing choke down, right? And that's very common. I think that to Ron's point, you can do that as well in terms of just paying for the extra boost out there.
Yeah,
thank you, gentlemen. Aaron,
like
sorry, go ahead.
To the software as a service vendors, we were talking as a service, that in the early days of the pandemic, you know, I was almost could predict who was going to have a problem, who was going to experience a slowdown and who wasn't. And it was the companies that were investing in their marketing. Many of the software as a service vendors were really beefing up their marketing to stay relevant,
Yep.
to show their customers and prospects why they needed that. Whereas some of the maintenance companies, like third-party maintenance companies, who needs marketing? We'll just go in with a lower price. They were really suffering.
Yep, 100% agreed. Aaron, last question before I turn it over to Rob.
Yeah, we have a few. I think Michael already spoke to the first one. How do you make a case for digital transformation investments when cost cutting is likely to occur?
I've got some ideas, unless you want to go to somebody else.
Go ahead.
All right,
Michael,
so
start it.
what we're seeing now, and with companies that are implementing new technologies and pursuing a path of digital transformation, is it's no longer just about filling gaps in functionality and automating. It's about creating strategic value for the business. So if you can build that case about this is the additional value we're going to create for ourselves and our customers, it makes the buy-in easier, and it gets people to stand behind those decisions they made about implementing this technology.
Great. Folks, I'm going to try to wrap it up here. It's 11:50. I'm trying to be sensitive of our attendees' time. What I'm going to do right now is bring up a page, and I have my colleague Rob on standby. Rob, I'm going to go ahead and share this page that you so kindly updated. And if you don't mind, go ahead and turn on your mic and camera, and off we go.
Sure. Yeah. So I think first off, thanks to all the panelists for joining. I think good discussion. So I tried to capture some of the key themes from the discussion, both in terms of the questions and the different perspectives. I think kind of started out with business is good or has been good, but especially the last few quarters, have sales really been good, or is inflation masking trouble, and we're just able to extract price, which is kind of masking what's really going on. Cost cutting will definitely become a focus. Investments and especially CapEx will come under greater scrutiny. I think there was a lot of discussion around the need to be thoughtful and really work with the CFO to make sure that cuts are strategic and not just even across the board. A lot of discussion around efficiency versus effectiveness, and are there ways to innovate, to use technology, to digitize, to automate in order to reduce costs in a different way than just cutting heads. I think a lot of good discussion around companies that are going to be successful coming out of a recession really need to be relevant, both to customers and to employees. And so I'll kind of get to the customer piece, but I thought it was really good that there's needs to be focused on key employees, especially need confidence in the direction of the company, that they're not going to jump ship and go somewhere else. In terms of that relevance to the employees, obviously aftermarket becomes more important. And the point was made by Ron that it could potentially account for greater than 100% of total profits. In terms of that relevance that Michael brought up, having the end users of that equipment, they're going to want to maintain and repair existing equipment rather than buy new equipment as frequently, right? And I think that kind of brought up the concept of, are there offensive expansion moves rather than just defensive moves that can be made, right? Are there acquisitions in the service and aftermarket space? Are there new value-add services that an OEM can bring? Should they look at multi-vendor service? And is this the impetus to go faster down the as-a-service business model path? I think all of this kind of came together with, the install base being really critical, and even more so in a recession than perhaps normally. It's the driver for aftermarket revenue, for word of mouth referrals, which we know are critically important, and even input to, where should the product go next. I think that the point was made by Sam in terms of you need a cheerleader, you need leadership around the install base. It doesn't just happen on its own. Definitely a lot of discussion around the data regarding your installed base being a challenge, and I know Michael had done a survey recently. Obviously, the fact that it's really disconnected slows a lot of people and reduces the value that they're getting from that data. And especially in a downturn, there's an opportunity to be more proactive with the install base engagement. And this is in terms of selling more service. This is in terms of marketing to make sure that the value prop of those services are understood and reinforced. And really kind of taking this as an opportunity to build strength as opposed to just kind of taking the peanut butter cost cutting approach.
Excellent. Well, Rob, thank you so much for the summary. But Sam, Michael, if you guys don't mind turning your cameras back on for a second. There's one more question. I think this Aaron just messaged me. There's one more question that came up. Let's see, what time is it? 11:55. Sure, go ahead, Aaron. Go ahead and ask a question.
Yeah, last question I see is how long do you predict the recession will last?
Well, let's see. I have a pair of dice in my hand. I'm trying to roll them on the table to see what will happen. How's that for an answer?
If I could predict it, I'd own an island in the Caribbean.
Exactly. Exactly.
Famous question is, how long is the piece of string? You know, it is what it is, and you only know when it's over when it's long after it's over.
That's true.
But I think what's important. But I think what's important is that when you talk about recession, like we said, it was 1.6 and 0.9. That's peanuts. That means the aftermarket is virtually not impacted. If anything, it grows because people are pushing back in CapEx. So actually, it benefits the aftermarket for most industries, not all.
Yep. Great. So with that, folks, I really appreciate all of you participating. I want to do one little advertisement for the community we're building. In fact, it's funny, Ron, Sam, Michael, all of us have been, we were trying to build this little community, we call it, around what we call Industry Next, but it's really people who care about making stuff and serving it, servicing it, serving the customer well. The Industry Next community. We have the next big event. We're planning for like a 2-hour event on September 22nd. Be there, be square. It's going to be interesting. We're kind of working through the guest list. Again, these are going to be subject matter experts who have nothing to do with Entytle, but have everything to do with the kinds of things you guys all care about. So we're excited about that session. Mark that. You'll start seeing more information about that coming over the next few weeks. So that is something that we're excited about. And then finally, on our behalf, thank you very much to Ron, Sam, and Michael. You guys have been amazing. I've always enjoyed our conversations one-on-one, but that's why I thought it'd be great to have you guys all together at this event. I'm excited in terms of the summary that we took away. I mean, Rob captured some of the thoughts really, really well. I mean, there's some wide-ranging discussions of value to everybody else out here. And again, I'm very, very thankful from our side to you to be able to have you guys as panelists here today. So thank you very much. We put the email addresses here. This recording will be shared with the participants for today's event. So you'll be able to get all this information. I also noticed a couple of messages I looked on when my camera's off that people weren't able to get in. We'll send that to them as well. With that, I'd like to wrap up today's session. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon and a happy end of July to you, to everybody this weekend. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.